What if someone tried to take $50,000 from you based on a rule from 1977, but they didn't read the fine print? That's exactly what my HOA did. They thought they had me cornered until I found a tiny legal loophole that flipped the whole thing upside down. I still remember the moment like it was yesterday. I was in my study, sorting through old property documents and paying bills, when an envelope arrived stamped with the official seal of the Homeowners Association. My heart sank as I unfolded the letter to discover a claim for $50,000, a fine levied based on an obscure regulation dating back to 1977. The letter was written in dense legal language that made no mention of modern circumstances. It read like a relic of another era. The HOA argued that my ranch, which I had lovingly maintained and modernized over the decades, violated a long-forgotten rule. They claimed I'd infringed on community aesthetics and property standards, even though I had always followed every guideline that made sense. For a split second, I felt trapped by bureaucracy, a David versus Goliath scenario where an archaic regulation was being wielded as a weapon. I envisioned the board members, confident in their outdated rulebook, smiling smugly as they declared my penalty. But as my pulse raced, a spark of defiant clarity ignited. I knew that rules written over 40 years ago, in a world that had long since changed, might contain a crucial loophole. I spent that night poring over legal texts, consulting with old property records, and reviewing every detail of the contested regulation. Slowly, through hours of painstaking research, I uncovered a tiny, but potent, clause that the board had completely overlooked. It explained that any claim made under that statute had to be updated periodically to remain enforceable. Since no update had ever been made, the fine was legally null and void. In that charged moment, I realized I held the power to turn their claim on its head. The letter, which was meant to intimidate and silence me, had instead opened the door for a bold, principled fight. I was not going to let the outdated whims of a handful of bureaucrats dictate the future of my ranch. That day marked the turning point. My tiny legal loophole was the key that would unlock my freedom. And so began the battle that would soon rock our community, expose the outdated practices of the HOA, and ultimately flip the power dynamic in my favor. My ranch, known as Oak Haven, has been in my family for generations. Nestled against rolling hills and bordered by a quiet, meandering creek, Oak Haven isn't just a piece of property. It's a testament to our family's heritage and a symbol of self-reliance. Over the decades, I've modernized the farm with sustainable practices, advanced irrigation systems, and even introduced some contemporary touches that blend tradition with innovation. I take pride in every acre of the land, and I've always believed that property should be respected as both a legacy and a living, evolving entity. Crescent Meadows, the gated community in which my ranch is located, paints a picture of suburban perfection. Every homestead is meticulously maintained, every tree pruned with exacting standards, and a local homeowners association enforces a strict code of conduct that governs even the smallest details. The HOA's rulebook, long since a cherished relic of past decades, is taken as gospel by many residents. Its guidelines, some of which date back to the 1970s, set the benchmark for what is deemed acceptable in our community. In this context, even the slightest deviation, a novel architectural idea, a unique landscape feature, can spark intense scrutiny and severe penalties. At the center of this strict regime is Karen Miller, known widely as HOA Karen. Now in her early 50s, Karen is a figure both revered and reviled. Clad in sharp, conservative attire with a clipboard always at hand, she patrols Crescent Meadows like a self-appointed sheriff. To many, her enforcement of the rules is a necessary measure to maintain order. To others, it is a symbol of relentless conformity that stifles creativity and individuality. Karen is known to file complaints for the tiniest infractions, whether it's a hedge trimmed a few inches too short or a decorative element that doesn't quite match the community's color scheme. Over the years, her fines have become a dreaded hallmark for residents who dare to think differently. I, however, have always been an independent spirit. While I respect the notion of community order, I believe that property is not merely a static display of uniformity. It is a dynamic space that reflects personal history, creativity, and the right to innovate. My farm stand, my seasonal art installations in the snow, and even my sustainable energy projects are expressions of that freedom. I built Oak Haven with a vision that marries tradition with progress, and I have nurtured it as a sanctuary for both my family's legacy and my own ideas. When the HOA recently issued a $50,000 fine, citing a 1977 rule that I supposedly violated, I felt that familiar pinch of injustice. The regulation in question was archaic, a relic from a time when our community was more a collection of identical houses than the vibrant, diverse tapestry it is today. The letter, thick with legal jargon, made it clear that Karen and the board believed they had the power to dictate every nuance of my property usage, regardless of the modern reality. But as I stared at that letter, a fire of defiance kindled within me. I knew that the rules of 1977 were not carved in stone. They were written on paper that could be read and, if one was clever enough, bent to one's advantage. In the silence of that moment, I resolved that I would challenge this outdated claim, not only for myself, but for every resident who had ever been bullied by an overzealous board. The battle for my property rights and for creative freedom was about to begin. The initial shock of the $50,000 fine quickly gave way to determination. I began gathering every piece of evidence I could find that would support my case. I combed through old documents, digging into the historical archives of Crescent Meadows and my own family records that dated back decades. I hired a local legal expert to help decipher the long-forgotten regulation, and after countless hours of research, I discovered that the rule on which the HOA based its claim had a built-in expiration. According to a rarely referenced clause, any fine levied under that regulation had to be updated every 10 years to remain enforceable. Since 1977, no such update had been made, rendering the entire claim null and void by law. Armed with my findings, I compiled a comprehensive dossier. The dossier included annotated copies of the original rule, side-by-side comparisons of its outdated language with current legal standards, and a detailed explanation of the legal loophole that I had uncovered. I also gathered testimonials from neighbors who had faced similar fines for other obscure reasons, stories that resonated with many who had grown increasingly frustrated with the HOA's outdated policies. The tension in Crescent Meadows was palpable as whispers of my challenge began to circulate. Neighbors who were once too timid to question the board started to speak up, sharing their own grievances about arbitrary fines and outdated rules. Online, the digital petition I launched against the $50,000 fine garnered thousands of signatures, each one a resounding call for reform. Hashtags such as hashtag legal loophole, hashtag property rights now, and hashtag no more bullying began trending across our community's social media channels, uniting residents under a common banner of resistance. Meanwhile, Karen Miller remained unrepentant, confident that her authority was unassailable. She dismissed my efforts as baseless legal trickery and doubled down on her stance that the fine was justified. At the next HOA meeting, Karen presented her own version of events, citing outdated memos and insisting that any deviation from community standards warranted severe penalties. But as I laid out the evidence in a calm, measured presentation, the tide of public opinion began to turn. I explained the legal loophole in clear, simple language, showing how a rule written in a bygone era had no bearing on our present-day lives. I reminded the board that property rights were enshrined in modern law, and that enforcing an obsolete fine would set a dangerous precedent. During heated exchanges at the meeting, voices grew louder and more impassioned. Some board members, swayed by the mounting digital evidence and the passionate testimonies of residents, began questioning Karen's long-held influence. Others, still bound by old habits, clung to the idea that every infraction, no matter how minor, must be punished. The internal conflict was deep, and as the meeting wore on, it became clear that this was more than a dispute over $50,000. It was a battle for the soul of our community. I ended the meeting with a challenge. If the board refused to repeal the fine, I would take my case to court. I promised that I would use every legal avenue at my disposal to ensure that the outdated rule and the baseless fine were struck down once and for all. The board's response was guarded, and whispers of uncertainty began to spread among the residents. For the first time in decades, it seemed that the old order might be shaken by the power of modern law and the collective will of a community determined to stand up for its rights. As I left the meeting, I could feel the eyes of the community upon me, their hope mingled with anticipation. The digital dossier, now a powerful symbol of resistance, had ignited a movement. I knew that my challenge was only the beginning of a long, arduous battle, a battle that would require relentless perseverance and unwavering faith in the law. And so, with the fine looming like a specter over my once tranquil property, I vowed to fight back with every legal, creative, and passionate tool at my disposal. In the days following the HOA meeting, the story of the $50,000 fine and my discovery of the legal loophole spread like wildfire through Crescent Meadows. Social media exploded with debates over property rights and the relevance of archaic regulations in today's world. My digital petition, coupled with my detailed dossier, received overwhelming support. Neighbors posted videos of their own fines and shared anecdotes about how the old rule had been used to penalize even the most innocuous activities. Local news outlets arrived on the scene. Reporters, cameras in hand, captured the growing tension on the streets. It's a David versus Goliath battle, one anchor proclaimed on live television, where a humble rancher is challenging a decades-old fine imposed by an unyielding HOA. Interviews with residents revealed a growing chorus of discontent. Many admitted that while they had respected the rules in the past, they were now fed up with arbitrary fines that stifled their personal expression and innovation. Within the HOA board, the divisions grew more pronounced. Emergency sessions were held behind closed doors, and leaked minutes showed impassioned debates among board members. Some members argued that the HOA should adapt to modern times and respect property owners' rights, while others insisted that strict adherence to the old rules was essential to preserving the community's image. The once unified front of the board was fracturing under the weight of public pressure and undeniable evidence. Karen Miller, who had been the staunch defender of these outdated policies, began to lose support as board members started questioning the legitimacy of the $50,000 fine. I used every opportunity to update the community. Through live streams, detailed blog posts, and frequent updates on local forums, I shared every piece of evidence, from scanned copies of the 1977 regulation and the key legal loophole to testimonies from neighbors who had experienced similar grievances. Every post was met with a surge of support, and hashtags like #LegalLoophole and #PropertyRightsNow became rallying cries that united the residents. Digital organizers held virtual town halls, discussing the need for reform and planning strategies for the upcoming public hearing that would decide the HOA's future direction. As the public hearing approached, the community's energy reached a fever pitch. Neighbors who had long suppressed their frustrations now gathered in droves at community centers and online platforms to prepare for this decisive moment. Flyers were distributed, and local influencers lent their voices to the call for change. The atmosphere was electric, a palpable mix of anger, hope, and unyielding determination. It was no longer just about my ranch. It was about reclaiming a community's right to govern itself by the current law, not by the relics of the past. Late one evening, I received a call from a trusted attorney who confirmed that, based on my research, the loophole in the 1977 rule was ironclad. With that legal backing, I felt even more empowered to challenge the HOA's fine in a public forum. The attorney explained how the outdated language had no force in modern property law and that, should the case go to court, our chances were exceedingly high. This news spread quickly, further fueling the digital movement and consolidating support among the community members. Karen Miller, however, wasn't ready to back down. In response to the mounting evidence, she ramped up her efforts, filing additional complaints and trying to intimidate residents into submission with threats of further fines. Her social media channels were filled with defensive posts, but each attempt to reassert her authority was met by a deluge of counterarguments and laughter from the online community. The tension finally culminated in the announcement of a final public hearing. The HOA board scheduled the meeting to be held at the Crescent Meadows Community Center, a decision that made it clear this confrontation was inevitable. In the days leading up to the hearing, I continued my relentless campaign, updating my digital dossier and rallying residents. The final countdown had begun, and every new post, every hashtag, and every shared story was a declaration that the community would no longer be cowed by outdated rules. On the morning of the hearing, the energy was palpable as residents from across Crescent Meadows converged on the community center. There was an air of expectancy mixed with a sense of historical significance, the feeling that this moment would redefine the balance of power in our community and set a new standard for property rights in the modern era. The decisive moment arrived on a brisk morning in a packed boardroom at the Crescent Meadows Community Center. The room was filled with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and a sea of impassioned residents, all gathered to witness the final public hearing that would determine the future of our community's enforcement policies. With a calm but resolute demeanor, Councilwoman Andrea Simmons stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the collective hope of a community that had had enough. After a thorough review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, copies of the original 1977 regulation, and expert legal analyses confirming the existence of a crucial loophole, we have reached an unmistakable conclusion. Councilwoman Simmons began, her voice clear and unwavering. It is abundantly clear that the $50,000 fine imposed on Mr., your last name, for alleged violations of a long-outdated rule is completely without merit. The regulation in question has not been updated since 1977, and according to the fine print, which, notably, the board failed to read, the statute is now null and void. This fine was not only baseless, it was an abuse of power driven by personal bias. A heavy silence fell over the room as Simmons continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines and sanctions related to this incident. Furthermore, we will initiate a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed an archaic rule to be used as a weapon against a private property owner. Today's decision is not merely about invalidating a fine. It is a resounding declaration that our community must move forward under the principles of modern law, transparency, and fairness. The room erupted in murmurs of approval as a respected community advocate, known for his tireless defense of property rights, rose to speak. Today, we stand united against the tyranny of outdated regulations, he declared, his voice imbued with passion. No resident should ever be forced to pay for a rule that belongs in a bygone era. Let this vote be the turning point that reaffirms our community's commitment to fairness, innovation, and the inalienable right to manage one's own property. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every arbitrary fine is erased. Following his address, a senior attorney presented the final legal dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence and legal analyses that demonstrated the loophole in the 1977 rule. The dossier included side-by-side comparisons of the outdated regulation with current laws, expert testimonies, and detailed annotations that left no doubt. The fine was void. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures for those who had allowed such an injustice to be levied upon a homeowner, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Simmons concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Crescent Meadows, a community where every resident's rights are protected and where our governing bodies operate on modern principles of justice and accountability." Our vote today is not just the rejection of an outdated fine. It is a bold declaration that we refuse to be held hostage by archaic rules and personal vendettas. Together, we stand for truth, progress, and the inalienable right to live without fear of arbitrary interference. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Crescent Meadows. The days of exploiting outdated regulations were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights and modern legal standards was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the decisive public hearing, Crescent Meadows underwent a transformation that resonated far beyond a single property dispute. News of the rescinded $50,000 fine and the sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and social networks, sparking vibrant debates about property rights, governmental accountability, and the evolution of outdated laws. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Crescent Meadows" and "Community United for Fairness," lauded the board's willingness to modernize and protect the rights of homeowners. Hashtags like #LegalLoophole, #PropertyRights, and #NoMoreTolling trended widely, reinforcing the newfound resolve of our community. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their own stories of bureaucratic overreach and to envision a future where individual freedoms were celebrated. Neighbors, who once accepted fines in silence, now spoke passionately about their right to live and work on their own property without fear of arbitrary sanctions. "Our land is our legacy," one resident declared at a busy town hall, "and we must protect it from those who would chain us to outdated rules." The atmosphere brimmed with hope and a sense of collective renewal, a promise that Crescent Meadows would forever prioritize fairness and progress. Within the reformed HOA board and local law enforcement agencies, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed launched comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, modern legal standards, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary processes were established to ensure that every complaint would be examined fairly, and that no resident would again be subjected to arbitrary fines rooted in historical inaccuracies. "Our duty is to safeguard each resident's rights," Lieutenant Reed affirmed at a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our community's commitment to justice. Local community advocates and civil rights organizations mobilized, organizing workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns to empower residents to protect their rights and to challenge outdated regulations. "When we unite, even the oldest rules can be rewritten," a passionate activist proclaimed at a meeting, inspiring neighbors to raise their voices and demand change. For me, the journey from receiving that ominous letter to exposing the legal loophole and ultimately overturning the $50,000 fine was both intensely personal and profoundly transformative. My fight was not solely about money. It was about ensuring that individual property rights and modern legal principles prevailed over archaic, oppressive practices. Neighbors, once cowed by arbitrary enforcement, found solace and empowerment in our shared victory. The digital evidence that had once threatened to ruin my livelihood became the rallying cry for a community determined to stand up for justice and progress. Karen Miller, once the staunch enforcer of outdated rules, was increasingly marginalized as residents embraced a future where creativity and independence were not only tolerated but celebrated. Her influence evaporated in the wake of the overwhelming evidence, and her name became synonymous with the dangers of clinging to obsolete practices. The transformation of Crescent Meadows was now a testament to the power of unity and the importance of reading the fine print. At a final celebratory event in the community park, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the glow of a setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights" was unfurled, and heartfelt speeches echoed through the crowd. "Today, we celebrate not just the overturning of an unjust fine," Councilwoman Simmons declared, but the triumph of modern justice and our unwavering dedication to protecting our rights. The standing ovation that followed affirmed our collective promise that no one, be it an overzealous enforcer or an archaic regulation, would ever again trample on our freedoms. As each new day dawned over Crescent Meadows, the legacy of that fateful legal battle endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how a $50,000 claim based on a rule from 1977 was exposed and nullified by a tiny legal loophole became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in progress, justice, and the sanctity of individual rights. Every sunrise carried with it the promise that Crescent Meadows would forever be a place where modern law, fairness, and community empowerment prevailed. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. United in our victory, we emerged more vigilant, more innovative, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it shone as a constant reminder that Crescent Meadows would forever champion creativity, integrity, and the power of a well-read fine print.